Welcome to SheVentures. I'm Doria, co-founder of CentSai. Listen to women who take risks, build community, and get shit done. Recording from Madison Avenue in New York City. I love what you're doing. You are a tutor, or were a tutor for many years in New York City.
Correct, yes.
And from that, you decided to start your own company, which is called The Critical Reader, and it publishes guides to the SAT grammar, writing, and ACT verbal.
Yes.
Parts.
And I also now I've branched out into the GMAT and the GRE as well. So I have also a book for the GMAT grammar, sentence corrections, and GRE vocabulary. And I also have now a book for the AP English Language and Composition exam. So
Fantastic. And that is a lot of writing.
it is a lot of writing, yes.
So one of the things that I want to say right off the bat, I was amazed that you got an 800 on the verbal part of your SAT. And while I have mixed feelings about the exam in general, which we can talk about
Most
later,
people do, yes.
how did you pull that off?
Honestly, I just read constantly as a kid. It's interesting because I wasn't one of those super early readers. I wasn't reading when I was like 3 or 4 years old.
Right.
I didn't really turn into like a fluent reader until I was really about 7. But I always loved to read, and I read everything. Fiction, nonfiction, horror, science fiction, like everything.
Did you also enjoy writing?
Not as I did, but not nearly as much as reading.
Okay.
Actually, the writing part came later to me.
Got it.
But I was also, in terms of vocabulary, I was lucky enough to go to a school that did really systematic vocabulary development starting in elementary school.
By systematic, do you mean memorizing?
Yeah. We had like weekly vocabulary tests. We used the Oxford, the Sadler series vocabulary workshop, I think starting when I was in about 5th grade. And so, yeah, we just had, weekly vocabulary tests, probably 5th through 11th or 12th grade.
So it wasn't a matter of you reading Toni Morrison at the age of 2. It was the education that you got. Did your parents play a role?
Not so much. I was encouraged, but there wasn't a lot of pressure.
Okay.
But for the vocabulary also, I studied both French and Latin in high school also, and so, we studied roots also, so it wasn't just a question of sitting there memorizing things, it was actually understanding the structure of the language, and, where words come from and how they relate to one another also.
Makes sense. And my daughter takes Latin right now in middle school, and I know that it's really important for understanding the root of a word.
Absolutely.
Even if you don't know what the whole word means, if
Right.
you at least know what that is.
That is, yeah, and being able to really put things together, and so putting it and really just being able to approach it from a logic standpoint instead of, okay, oh my God, I have to memorize this whole random list of things that have nothing to do with one another.
So you were a tutor for about almost a decade.
Yeah. I started tutoring my senior year in college. Actually, it was my work-study job.
Okay.
Tutoring for the French department.
And one of the things that I read about you was that you were looking for material, and you really didn't find much out there that you felt was properly suitable.
Yeah. That's pretty much how it happened. I'd had, when I was tutoring, before I really started tutoring the SAT, I just found, some random jobs on Craigslist, these test prep companies that were looking for people to write writing questions for the SAT.
So they outsourced them.
They outsourced them, yeah. This was around 2007, and so the SAT had the previous change in 2005, where they had added what used to be the writing SAT2 to the main SAT. So all of a sudden they needed just a lot of questions for kids to practice with. And so, I had my blue book, I had my official guide, and, I sat down and I labeled what all the questions were testing, and, I got a sense of how the exam worked, basically, and then, I'd go out and I'd find sentences that seemed to match. But at that point, it didn't occur to me that I could do it for myself, and I didn't realize...
I want to just stop you there.
Sure.
So you did a very systematic analysis of the test.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, I still have my falling apart official guide from probably 2000. I don't even know, probably 2007 maybe. That has, I think it was the original one was published in 2005, and it still has, my notes for every single writing question. So I actually, it still has my notes where I have every single writing question labeled with what it's testing and sort of the subcategory and the way it's testing it.
So it's very formulaic.
Extremely, yeah. I mean, it's a really pretty fixed set of rules. There were about 20 concepts they were testing. But sometimes they would do it this way, sometimes they would do it that way. Sometimes they would do pronoun agreement with it, sometimes they would do it with they. Subject-verb agreement. Sometimes they'd stick a non-essential clause between the subject and the verb. Sometimes they'd stick a prepositional phrase. Sometimes they'd flip the subject and the verb.
Sure.
So, there were these large categories, and then within those categories, there were basically a fixed number of structures that they would test. So it was very formulaic.
And so you were able to map everything out, and then also you were able to do what a lot of entrepreneurs do, which is field research, right?
Yeah.
You're a tutor. Yeah. And so over the course of 8 years, how many people would you say you tutored?
Oh my goodness. I'm not, I have no idea. I didn't have that many students at a time. It's not like I was teaching 30 hours a week, but
right.
I probably tutored maybe 75 kids.
Okay.
Something like that, 75,
and
100.
who is your typical student?
Well, it started out that I was tutoring mostly kids in Manhattan, private school kids. Occasionally, I'd have people from the exam schools, Stuyvesant or Bronx Science. I had a few of those. But then it actually shifted once I started tutoring on Skype. And so I ended up having people from all over the country. I had a few international also.
Very cool.
So, I had public school students in Texas. I had homeschoolers in Florida.
Were you able to change what you charged based on need?
I did have a sliding scale, at one point.
Because I know, for example, in New York City, private tutors are incredibly expensive.
But I actually, when I started working on Skype, this was really, I think, after my book had come out, and
right.
That's how people had heard of me.
Yes.
And so by that point, I was really just charging a fixed rate for everybody. There was no difference between the Manhattan people and anybody else.
Understood. So I took the SAT in the 80s. What's changed between now and then?
Well, the test has undergone 2 big changes since then.
Okay.
The first major change there were 3 actually. So in 1 involving scoring and 2 involving content. So in 1995, 94, 95, 95, I believe, scores were recentered because verbal scores were falling too much, essentially. And so scores were recentered to shift them upwards. They said, because the composition of the testing pool had changed, and, there were these demographic shifts, but basically it was becoming a problem that scores were falling.
And it was across the board on SAT and ACT?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
The ACT, actually. The ACT underwent some changes of its own.
But we're talking about
the SAT,
here.
Sure. And they didn't what happened with the SAT and the ACT didn't exactly parallel one another in terms of time. So that was the first change. And then in 2005 was the bigger change, where basically, 1, they eliminated the analogies. which
I liked those.
I liked the analogies. Those analogies were fun, I thought. I admit, I enjoyed them. They kept them on the GRE until a few years ago, but and then they took them off also. But they got rid of the analogies, and they shifted the vocabulary just to the sentence completions. And then they also took what was formerly the writing SAT 2, and they basically just tacked it on to the SAT. So people may, they're adding the essay, they're requiring, they're making this huge change. It was really what was there all along.
Okay.
But the only difference was that usually the kids who were taking the writing SAT 2 were really just it was a more select group, because really only very selective colleges were requiring the SAT 2.
Got it.
At that point, and so there was a big change in who was actually having to write the essay. And of course, there were all sorts of issues with the essay, because basically, it was a strict writing assignment. It was just, really, do you know how to cobble together an argument? Do you know how to make a thesis? Do you know how to use supporting evidence? But they weren't looking at factual content. And so it turned out that you could write all sorts of outrageous things and still get a very good score.
Interesting.
And there was a guy at, I think it's Les Perlman at MIT, who did this statistical analysis of writing scores, and showed things that were just terribly embarrassing for the College Board. So the essay was always pretty controversial.
Okay. So today, is it back to just the math and the verbal?
Well, the essay is optional now, but an increasing number of colleges are dropping it. And so then the SAT was, so I'm going to get to that right now. The SAT was changed again in 2016, and that was the really, really big change. They got rid of the vocabulary, essentially. Obscure words, quote unquote. It's actually like relatively middle of the road, college level, New York Times level vocabulary, but they
like
college
the word
board,
acumen or something like that.
Exactly. Okay. Tenacity.
And the reasoning for that is?
And the reason for that, well, the major reason is that they needed to compete with the ACT. The ACT, I believe in 2012, became the more popular college admissions test. It actually surpassed the SAT for the first time ever.
Interesting.
And the ACT also had all of these state testing contracts. It was mandated for high school graduation in, pretty sure, Illinois, Colorado, Michigan, a bunch of other states. And the SAT was basically redesigned so that it could displace the ACT in the state testing market. And this is a big part of the change that actually does not really get talked about. Because the College Board came in, with this whole social justice narrative and saying, we're going to make it a better test, we're going to make it a fairer test, we're only going to test relevant words. So it was a bit Orwellian, actually.
Yes, and it sounds very political.
It was extremely political.
Okay. So changes have happened, and they sound mostly political from how you're describing them.
Extremely.
And I was thinking about both of us as entrepreneurs, and I think that in many ways we're both disruptors in our respective fields. For me, it was about financial information, and while my background is not in finance, what was bothering me was that people were being fed a lot of financial jargon and were therefore unsure and afraid. And in your case, you couldn't find good questions, and so you wrote your own.
Pretty much, yeah. It's very interesting, actually, if you look at the test prep market just sort of from a business perspective, just as a case study. I realized sort of after I'd done all this, just looking back on it, that it's really a fascinating example of a market that looked like it was closed from the outside. Because, if somebody had told me before I decided to write my first book, if somebody had told me, I don't know, 2006, 2007, that I would write an SAT book, I would have looked at them like they were completely insane. Because you go into the bookstore and, there are
so many. There's Kaplan.
Again, in Princeton Review and Barron's,
right.
and, just shelves and shelves of them. And it looks like the market is completely closed and, just dominated by these few big established brands.
Right.
But when I started writing my own stuff and I started, corresponding, I had my blog. And so I would get emails from, kids who were studying for the test.
And let's just talk about that very briefly.
Absolutely.
You started a blog.
Yes.
And that also had to do with something that was troubling you, which was the socio-economics and the fact that people who can't afford to have a tutor weren't enjoying the benefits that...
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I admit I did take a Kaplan class when I was in high school for the math. But, my family certainly couldn't have afforded, this kind of private tutoring. And
right.
it was completely unheard of. It was not part of my background.
Right.
And, I was really enjoying tutoring at that point, and the kids were great. But I'm thinking, to have somebody sitting there with you explaining, every piece out like this. And I realized that not many people had analyzed the test to the point at which I had analyzed it to have access to that. It just started to rub me the wrong way a little bit. It was just, I didn't want to be responsible for perpetuating this kind of inequality. It made me uncomfortable.
And so you started a blog.
And I figured I would just say, and I thought, okay, everything I say to my students, every tip, every strategy, every rule, I'm just going to go and I'm going to make it public, and so that anybody can have access to it.
Which is amazing. And so you say in hindsight, your reason for doing it was very altruistic and noble one. Another SAT word there.
Yes.
But it ended up being a marketing tool unintentionally.
Unintentionally, absolutely, yeah. I mean, writing a book was not on my radar when I started the blog originally.
And then you started getting people...
Yeah, and I started getting just more and more content, pretty much, because, I was going and I was tutoring and I was having to write out the same things over and over and over again. And... my hand was getting tired. I was really getting sick of writing the same thing over and over again. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could just type this up and hand kids a packet and be like, here, learn this. So I did that. And at the same time, I was, just developing all these questions because I didn't like what I was seeing in the bookstore.
Right.
So I would just, I'd be reading an article and I'd be like, okay, that's a great sentence. Here, let me see if I can just take this and sort of rearrange it and make an SAT style sentence out of it. So I just kept accumulating those, and I actually was doing them separedly.
So you really immersed yourself kind of as all entrepreneurs do, right? 24/7, you're thinking about.
And I'd written so many, after a certain point, I've written so many questions. Even now, I'll be reading something and I'll be like, that's a great question. That's a great sentence. You see this, I see it in terms of structure. Structure and content, where I just be like, okay, this is great. Let me just take this.
And so you put it in a book.
Yep.
You decided to self-publish.
Yep.
And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. For anyone who's listening who might decide to self-publish, what did you learn along the way?
Oh my goodness, I learned so many things. I'm not even sure where to start with that. The first thing, I guess, because I really, I didn't know anything about self-publishing when I started doing this. It wasn't like I started out by saying, oh, I want to self-publish a book. I actually considered shopping it around initially to publishers,
right.
And I was gonna start writing proposal letters and all of that.
And you had some reasons as to why you didn't want to do that.
Part of it was just speed. I knew the book was working. I knew the exercises were working because I was trying them out on my students.
Right.
And I had kids who bought the beta version of the book. I was actually selling it online, very, very early version of it. And they really did very well after using it. And so I thought, okay, this thing works. I don't want to wait, 6 months, a year, however long, or even longer than that.
It can take a
very long time. Yeah, and there didn't seem to be a reason to wait.
Plus, you lose control, I think, over the narrative.
That was another major concern for me, because the book wasn't really. I wasn't trying to capture or to target the same audience as a Kaplan or a Princeton review. I had some sort of students who were, scoring, and sort of in the mid-range, but I had a much larger group, or actually two much larger groups. One of kids who were scoring well, so maybe 650 to 700, but really wanted that 800 and really wanted to be, spectacular, who are aiming for the Ivies. And then I also had students a lot of whom were not native English speakers or came from non-English speaking homes, who were scoring much, much lower, 500s, even high 400s, who wanted to be in the 700s.
There are some English speakers, by the way, who also
No, I do know that. But I'm just saying in terms of my specific, terms of my specific market, who wanted to get their scores up 250, 300 points. So these were the kids who were coming to me,
right?
Pretty much. And these were students who were not being served by any material on the market. And, having worked with them and having corresponded with them, I had a pretty good understanding of their needs, and I had a pretty good understanding of how they needed to have things explained, also because I taught foreign languages.
Right.
So I really understood how they needed to have things broken down for them.
And so you decided to do this expeditiously.
Yeah.
In the self-publishing realm. How does one? I don't know myself. How does one self-publish?
It's actually really easy.
Okay.
I literally just did a Google search for self-publishing or self-publishing platforms, and I found out that there were a few major ones at that point. CreateSpace, which is division of Amazon, Lulu, BookBaby. I'm sure there are some others, but I basically, they all offer sort of various advantages and disadvantages, but I went with CreateSpace because it was just, it offered the best royalty structure, and it seemed like the most straightforward. You just literally uploaded the book, right, and, waited 24 hours for the file to be checked and hit publish, and it went on Amazon. It was it is unbelievably easy. It was really incredibly straightforward process.
How do you the expression "judge a book by its cover"?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? Because people do evaluate material by the cover.
I really am not sure what I was thinking when I put out the book originally. I just used the CreateSpace template. And I created something that was very striking looking, but not terribly polished. And I wasn't really thinking in terms of marketing or anything like that at that point. I just wanted people to notice it. So it had this horrible bright yellow cover.
It must have stood out.
Well, exactly. I wanted it to stand out, but I found out later, this was really funny. One of my students, Kayor's mother, came to me and said, "Tell Erica what happened in your English class." And it turned out that the kid's teacher had stood up and held up my book and said, "Don't judge this book by its cover."
So there you have it.
And so I thought, oh no, this is bad. It was actually selling pretty well, right, considering. It got talked up a lot on College Confidential, which is the big website with, the forums where the kids go on and talk, make each other crazy, and the parents about applying to college and test scores. And the SAT, the test prep forums were really, really active at that point. So people were willing to look past the cover. But at a certain point, I said, you know what? Like, if I'm going to do this for real, like, I need to hire somebody who knows what they're doing. So
you did a new cover.
I did a new cover, yeah.
And I've
been through several templates since then. So now I have...
And you're on your 4th edition, correct?
I'm on the 4th edition of the grammar book and 3rd edition of the reading.
And how do the economics work with self-publishing? So do you pay a certain amount up front?
There are no fees up front for...
So they're taking on the cost of publishing?
And printing, yeah. So
do they evaluate it? Will they publish anyone?
They will publish anyone. There's no filter.
Okay.
You can purchase, I believe, formatting or editing services from them. They offer that as, a package. I never did. I hired my own formatter for the first book.
So in many ways, it's a huge democratization.
Extremely. It's quite extraordinary. Obviously that has upsides and downsides.
Sure.
The upside being that, there's no filter. You can just get it to market immediately. And the downside is that anyone can publish. There's no filter. You can get it to market immediately.
Yes. It's a double-edged sword.
But, if you're willing, if you actually know a lot about a subject and you're willing to, and you have an audience, like a ready-made audience, which I happen to have, and, I field tested everything with them, and you're willing to invest in making sure that you have something that looks professional, then, it can work.
So what percentage do they take of every book?
They take about 60%.
60%. And then if you publish it on Amazon, does Amazon also take a percentage?
Well, CreateSpace is Amazon.
Although, okay.
Actually, yeah. So now they're actually combining with Kindle Direct Publishing.
Got it.
But so CreateSpace is being phased out. But the royalty structure is staying the same as far as
so it's 60-40.
60-40, yeah.
And are your books available digitally as well?
Not I digitized one of the first edition of the SAT grammar book, but the demand just didn't seem quite as high.
Okay.
And I wasn't also thrilled with the formatting. So I've held off. I'm looking into digitizing the current editions. That's one of the things that's sort of there on my plate. I do prefer, and I think there is a benefit to having it available, especially for the international kids, because I get emails from kids who are saying, I'm in India, I'm in Bangladesh, I'm in Tanzania, I'm in Australia, I can't
buy it.
Yeah, although they're applying to college in the United States as international students where they're not really available for financial aid. It's like,
yeah.
Then I don't really know what to say.
Right.
But the reading would be a little bit more complicated because then I would have to get electronic reprint permissions for everything.
Oh,
and right now I just have,
And so I would imagine that the publishers handle all the legalities, which I'm not even sure what they would be. I guess reprinting in different, if you decided to reprint in India, China, wherever. Well,
that's
not China.
so much. Well, I have international reprint, or I have international reprint rights for most of the passages I use, because that's actually one of the things that distinguishes my books. The real tests use stuff that's been written in the last few decades.
Your material is original.
Is original, yeah. No, it's not original. No. So I use the same material that the real tests use.
Got it.
But that means that I have to get permission to reprint everything.
From the College Board?
No, not from the College Board, from the publishers of the individual books or articles.
Got it. But what about the questions themselves?
Those I write. Yeah, those are all original.
Understood. So the passages are the ones that you need to get permission.
I get permission for, and I have international, but I don't have electronic. So if I were going to do the reading book electronically, I would have to go and get individual permission for electronic rights for everything. So that's just kind of a logistical hassle.
How many books have you sold to date?
I'm guessing about 160,000, maybe between 160 and 170 at this point, somewhere around there.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Are you proud of that?
I am proud of that. Yeah, I cannot say that I ever expected to sell anywhere near this many. I mean, it really was fly by the seat of my pants when I started doing it.
I think as it is for all entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah. And it was really, it was a big learning curve. It was it was an education.
So your primary distribution is Amazon. Are you looking to widen that?
I am. I'm selling the books through my website also now.
And what is that for our listeners?
It's www.thecriticalreader.com.
Okay, great. Luckily, Amazon is a huge distribution.
It's a huge distribution. It's a major, yeah. But, I do get emails from, but yeah, it's complicated. But I do get emails from kids saying, I need your book right away. Is it in the bookstore? And I have to say probably not. Like, right. I can't guarantee it.
Are you able to get it onto college campuses?
I have some, yeah. Columbia University is carrying my books now.
Okay.
And I've been meaning to actually go down to NYU and talk to them also about it.
But are you a one-woman show?
I'm pretty much a one-woman show, yeah. I have an assistant, I have, another person helping me, and then, I have my proofreader and my book design, my cover designer and everything, but I do pretty much everything myself.
So what that makes me think of, because I've been at CentSai for 3 years, and there's a lot that, and I think you've alluded to this, that you don't know when you start a venture. And there's a tremendous amount of burnout that happens.
It can be really hard.
And how do you deal with that?
That's a process that I'm still going through, actually.
Me too.
Because I haven't really, these last 2 months are actually the first time that I've really been able to take a break in pretty much 7 years.
That's a long time.
Because, what happened was, I finished writing the SAT books. The College Board, basically as soon as I finished writing them, the College Board announced that it was changing the test. So in the meantime, I went and wrote the ACT books because nobody knew what was going to happen to the SAT. By that point, by the time I was done with that, they changed the test, and so I had to go and rewrite the SAT books. 1,500 pages of material. Ultimately, that I had to. And
I would imagine you probably no one actually really knew how they were going to change it.
No one really knew how they were going to change it. I had basically a blueprint to work from, and so the new editions, I basically had. I was a lot of guesswork. I actually got it almost all right, but it was pretty hair raising. So I couldn't stop, actually, because, even if even if I just wanted to say, this is too much for me, I can't do it, and just walk away, even if I personally felt like that, I had kids all over the world counting on me for this stuff.
Yeah.
And, they're completely on edge because they don't know what's going to be on this test either. And so it was an enormous amount of pressure, and I felt an enormous amount of responsibility to them. And so, I couldn't stop.
I really identify with that because I feel that often too, where there are some days you wake up and you're just like, shit, I don't know what is going to happen.
Yeah.
And you have to pivot almost every day, minute, second. You don't know.
You don't know. Yeah. And the reading book, especially, the grammar is, it's challenging to write, but it's straightforward at least.
Right.
There are rules. It's, there's a clear form, there's a clear outline.
Not for entrepreneurship.
The reading is a level of difficulty beyond just, there's nothing compares to the difficulty of writing a book for reading, because there are so many aspects involved.
Right.
And when I wrote the original critical reader, for example, it took me about a year and a half, but it was every single day I had to wake up and plan out, okay, today I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Tomorrow I'm going to do, JKL. Every single day I had to do that just incrementally, and I could not let myself stop for even a day, because if I had stopped, I don't know if I would have been able to make myself go back to it. It was so hard.
How did you do it?
I'm still not even sure. I'd never, it's funny because when I was in high school, a little, when I was in college, maybe a little still, less so, but still I was a terrible procrastinator, and I can still be a terrible procrastinator for certain things. And this was the first time in my life where I actually could not afford to do that. And so I just had to force myself basically to say, okay, I'm going to do this today, and I'm going to do this tomorrow, and then I'm going to do this.
How did you manage, or did you manage? Because this is something I struggle with a lot myself, is yes, I'm 100% involved with my business, and I also have 2 daughters.
Yeah.
But I know that other parts of my life have been drastically affected.
It's very hard.
Friendships.
Yeah.
I have virtually no social life. And it's by choice because I'm working 18-hour days.
Yeah.
But I also, for example, 5 years ago, I ran the marathon, which is coming up this weekend. I can't even imagine running a mile today. So what were the sacrifices personally that you feel that you've made to get where you are?
I mean, definitely the social life takes a hit.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's very hard to go out and be social when you've been staring at a computer for the last, 13, 14 hours straight. I mean, I was working 70-hour weeks.
Right.
So just and also working for yourself and being able to compartmentalize, and like I have friends who can just walk away from work and they leave what's at work, and they can be fully off, and I can't do that. I mean, I've brought my computer on probably my last 5 vacations.
Yeah, me too.
I cannot be away from it. I mean, I try, but I'm always I might have to put up something on my blog. I might have a question that only I can answer. I might have to have a Skype meeting about my logo.
So do you envision a time where you might be able to bring someone else on so that you can at least have a vacation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm slowly getting there.
Okay.
I am, actually. I mean, I just started working with somebody who can take some of this off my plate. I have my assistant who's wonderful, who's been handling the logistical stuff for me,
which is huge.
Huge. I mean, I could not function without her. Who handles, all the bookkeeping and things like that. I could not. And also just the daily emails. I don't understand what this question means. And they haven't read the question right. Can you send PDFs of my book to India?
How often do you get that?
I have maybe once every couple of weeks now. I actually have a page on my website entitled "Why I Cannot Send You PDFs of My Books."
Right. It's amazing. Well, it's also amazing how, we're both content creators, and oftentimes I think people overlook the time and effort that's put into creating content.
They can't imagine. I think they just have no idea, or occasionally somebody will find a typo. I mean, my manuscripts are they're really complicated, and I employ multiple proofreaders. I do everything I can, but we're human beings,
right?
And it's like I've had people just go on Amazon and write me screaming 1-star reviews. I found a typo. He doesn't know what he's talking about. We should buy this book, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you know what? Do you know how many hundreds, if not thousands of hours I put into this? Like, I'm a human being. Let me know and I'll fix it.
Exactly.
Just let me know and I'll fix it.
And the thing about reviews, and I've learned this recently on Glassdoor, is that people tend to, Amazon might be an exception where people write positive reviews as well, but people tend to only write when they're angry. So you only hear the angry reviews.
I mean, I've
get positive, I'm sure,
plenty
too.
positive ones, but
Yes.
but then, and you know, especially with grammar, oh man, grammar makes people go insane.
Your book is very highly rated.
Grammar makes people go crazy, though.
So I wanted to just go back to the test itself for a
Absolutely.
minute. So I have my own personal reservations about standardized testing. One of them is that I've seen very bright, motivated people do horribly on these tests.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
Conversely, I've seen very lazy people. I mean, there's one in high school in particular. This guy, I'm not going to mention his name, but he was a procrastinator and just really, he was naturally very bright, but just didn't want to work. And he got an 800 on the math and I think like a 760 on the verbal. And he ended up, I think, doing 2 years of college and then just dropping out.
Yeah.
Because he couldn't deal with it. And so, what are your thoughts around that?
I mean, you know, my thoughts have changed a little bit since the SAT was redesigned. It used to be a much better test. I actually have serious problems with it now. I mean, you know, I absolutely understand the reservations about standardized testing. You know, something a lot of people have problems with. From my perspective, I think it can be a useful tool if they're considered very much in context of, you know, you have to get the full picture of an applicant. It's only useful to basically to either, you know, to confirm the rest of an application or to maybe suggest that somebody has been underperforming in school. I mean, for me, conversely, it was actually the opposite of what you're saying, because my grades in English were not fabulous in high school. I mean, they were okay, they were fine. But I mean, you know, like I got a B- in English freshman year. I had a really, 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 really hard teacher. But I was sort of like an A-, maybe B+-ish student, and my grades did not reflect what I was capable of.
Why do you think that is?
I mean, part of it was just that the grading was extremely difficult. But also, I don't know, I never really got high school English class. I could never really figure out what my teachers wanted. I didn't really learn to write a paper until I became a French major, and you know, things were done in a very, very structured way. And I actually learned about rhetoric, and I was given the tools and I was given a system for actually analyzing things and learned to put them together. And once I had that, I thought, oh, this is so much easier. I wish somebody had taught me this years ago.
And that kind of relates back to your books, because if I were to ask you, what are some of the tips and tricks that one can employ for the verbal part of the SAT?
I mean, if we're just talking strictly about strategies, I mean, you know, there are little things that I've seen make a big difference in kids, like, for example, take a break between the passages. Like, even if you think you're a little pressed for time, stop 15, 20, 30 seconds and just let yourself reset mentally, because you're getting tired even if you don't know it. And I used to see this with the ACT especially all the time, because the English section is 45 minutes and it's 75 questions. And kids would do, when I looked at the score report, the kids would be doing really, really well in the first half, and then they would, you know, then they just start to tank in the second half. And they were just getting tired. And you know, it's a lot. It's intense, and your brain just starts to cloud over as you go through it. And I said, you know, I don't care if you don't feel tired. You need to stop and you need to take a break and just let yourself reset before, instead of just keep crashing through this.
And it seems like your book, I admit I have not read it cover to cover. However, I did notice that in one section, and this seems to be a theme in what you're talking about, is logic and structure. So how do you apply those, or how? I guess maybe the question I'm really getting at is, what is the differentiator between your books and that of Kaplan or Princeton Review?
Absolutely. Okay, so there are a few major differences. The major one I would actually say is content more than anything else. My books go really in depth, and because what I noticed with reading through some of the other books is they would give you a rule. For example, they would give you the very general form of the rule, or they'll tell you, they're going to test subject-verb agreements. It's a little bit more true for the old SAT, but it's a good illustration. And, or they would say, they'll put stuff between the subject and the verb. I mean, I actually don't know this specifically, but this is just sort of just general illustration. I'm not saying we do specifically this. But, and then they'll give like an example with maybe a prepositional phrase. They'll give maybe an example with a non-essential clause, information with between two commas. But they won't really explain what that information is. Mm-hmm. They also won't explain how to find the subject of a verb. They won't explain what parts of speech can be a subject, because a lot of kids won't know that something like a gerund like writing papers is hard, not writing papers are hard. A lot of kids will look at the noun that's right next to that verb and just assume that it's the subject. So something that looks like it's really simple on the surface actually has all sorts of components that really are very challenging and that need to be explained piece by piece. And that's what you don't find in the other books.
Which I definitely saw in your book. And do you think that's done by design to trick students?
I don't see, I have issues with this whole idea of a trick. I wrote a very long time ago, one of my first blog posts was actually entitled "Tricky is in the Eye of the Beholder." Because I think, and I don't know if it was Princeton Review, but there's this very well established narrative around standardized tests. Oh, they're trying to trick you. They put stuff between the subject and the verb because they're trying to trick you. Nobody ever puts prepositional phrases between subjects and verbs in real life. It's like, I think they do things that students tend to have trouble with.
Right.
And that's why they're tested. In real life, you need to be able to identify, okay, this is subject, this is the verb, so your writing will be basically grammatical correct. If you want to interpret that as a trick, you can interpret that as a trick.
Right.
Or you can interpret that as, okay, you still
knowing
need to know your
basic
grammar.
I remember in 5th grade that I actually had to diagram sentences.
Nobody diagrams sentences anymore.
That's not taught anymore.
It's not taught anymore, no.
And one of the scariest things I ever heard my older daughter say is, I don't need to know how to spell because my spell checker will pick it up.
Right.
And that's pretty much how it goes.
Yep. And I was working because, I kept seeing this with high school junior after high school junior. They didn't know parts of speech. You can't talk about prepositional phrases if you don't know what a preposition is.
Of course.
And you can't talk about prepositions about prepositions are if they can't remember what prepositions are, and you're having the same conversation week after week.
Right.
Where they just can't retain it. I used to see this. Some kids would pick it up right away, but then there were also kids we would go over it week after week after week, and they just couldn't seem to retain it.
Why do you think that is?
I think they just didn't have enough practice memorizing things.
Right.
It takes practice.
Well, and I think that as I've noticed this also with my children, that we've moved away 100% from any kind of rote memorization.
Yeah.
I remember with times tables, different topic, but whether
it's
or not I understood it, I had to
know
memorize
it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And my kids, no.
Right. Yeah. And obviously you don't want to do everything just from, disconnected mere facts. Right. But that's what the conversation has become, that any kind of memorization is discarded, just sort of disparaged out of hand. And there needs to be a balance. And also, when kids are learning, there are different levels of comprehension.
Yes.
When kids are learning things for the first time, sometimes you need to give them the simple version of the rule. Sometimes you just need to say, okay, you just just need to know this. And then, you know, as you see how that particular concept interacts with other concepts, then you can bring in a more sophisticated understanding of it.
And I definitely think that you have that, you can see that light bulb moment with
right.
kids that you're tutoring
when they get it.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes things need to be presented in a very simple, concrete way initially to lay the foundation for being able to do more sophisticated things.
Foundation is essential. I looked at the stats from College Board. I was just curious, and it seems like it tells the same story as it did when I took the SAT, which is that women score slightly lower as an aggregate to men. And then when I looked at race, the aggregates were that Asians scored highest at 1223, whites at 1,123, Hispanics 990, and the Black population on average 946. What goes into that disparity, do you think?
I mean, there are years of accumulated socioeconomic factors playing into those disparities. I mean, I think the SAT, the standardized testing in general, takes an enormous amount of flack for all these numerous factors, from housing segregation to to who can afford and live in what neighborhood, to taxation funding public schools,
right.
who can afford to go where, who can afford to pay for tutoring. Obviously that's a component of it, but tutoring also for academic tutoring, not just for test prep tutoring, who has access to stable housing, who has enough to eat. I mean, there are all sorts of factors that go into it, and it's impossible to, what you see in standardized testing is the culminating influence of a huge host of factors.
And I think that is why so many people that are critics of the exam, right, say, okay, so this is what we're doing to equalize. This
right.
is what we're doing to say everyone's had education up to senior year. It's supposedly a level playing field. Right. And so colleges are going to evaluate people based on these numbers in addition to other factors.
Right.
But those factors aren't really fair.
Right, but the thing is, none of the factors involved in the college application process are fair. A transcript, fine. People say, look at transcripts. Okay, well, who has access to AP classes? Who has access to subject tutoring? Who has parents who can call up the school and say, why did my kid get a B in this class instead of an A?
Right.
Who can afford to pay $50,000 a year for private school? Who can afford to hire a private tennis coach for their kid so that they can become a championship player. Extracurricular sports, massive tip to athletes at top schools, but nobody's saying, well, how much did they really pay for tennis coaching?
Right.
It's
so what you're saying basically is it's never a level playing field.
It's never a level playing field.
So what can we do because it seems as though you and I both deeply care about the socioeconomic part of it. So what can we do as entrepreneurs?
I mean, from my perspective, I think what I can do is simply, one, make the information available. So have a complete curriculum, essentially saying, here, this is what you know, this is the full range of things that you have to know. And just, put it out there and make it accessible. Yes, the books do cost money. They're about $25-$30 a piece.
How much is yours? I don't remember.
So they sell. They retail for basically between $30 and $35 on Amazon. They're lower on I sell them for lower on my website.
Okay.
So basically between like $21 to $25.
Got it.
They do cost something. But I also have a huge number of free articles on my website. A lot of the content that's covered in the books is covered separately on the site.
And so that's your attempt at democratizing knowledge, which is similar, I think, to what we're doing at CentSai, which is giving free information in terms of stories to help with financial concepts.
Yeah.
So I agree that democratization helps.
And I've had people, I've had people just study from the website and have their scores go up 150 points without ever spending a cent.
That's incredible. What is the average differential when they start or do you have?
I don't have those figures.
Probably depends on the student.
It depends. Yeah. It's interesting. There's studies that the College Board has done showing that students only gain an average of something like 15 points after prep. I think that you can't really lump all prep together.
Right. It sounds like there's a big difference.
There's a big difference, yeah.
So, as a woman and as an entrepreneur, have you ever felt silenced in any way?
That's an interesting question. Not so much. I think I've been very lucky in that regard. There have been small eye-opening moments. For example, a couple of years back, I was interviewed for a documentary called The Test. It's basically about the SAT, and the person putting together, I did like a roundtable panel of tutors, and I was the only woman there, which was extremely odd because there were maybe 12, 13 of us, and I thought, seriously, you could not find one other woman who tutors these tests? Like, do you know how many female tutors there are?
Right.
It was very bizarre.
And more women, I think, tend to be in education,
right,
on a whole.
On the whole, yeah, but the playing field is very tilted. At I think like the elite tutoring level, and I won't mention names, but there's a company in Manhattan, for example, that's based in Manhattan that hires very, very high level tutors, and if you look at they let tutors set their own rates, and if you look at the salaries, if you look at the disparity is astounding between male tutors and female tutors.
So you're able to see?
They post their rates.
So the women are actually posting their rates lower?
Much lower. Or the men are just posting their rates higher.
What do you make of that?
I think part of it is a confidence issue, where men are just more likely to value their competencies higher. I think that's the primary driving factor behind it. Some of them, I think they maybe are slightly more of them are more experienced on the whole than the women. That should not be sufficient to explain. The gap is one of the biggest gaps I've ever seen. It's astounding.
Now I'm very curious, and I will take a look at some point.
It's really quite impressive. And one of the people actually asked me a long time ago to come in and do some training for a company, and he was offering me probably maybe 40% less than my current rate. And I was like, no, why would I do that? It didn't even occur to me to think about it in gender terms at that point. But later on, I thought, why would you do that to somebody? Why would you insult somebody like that? And, there have just been little, just tiny flashes of what I think women experience. But I've been very lucky that I've been largely insulated from that. Although occasionally I wonder how my books would perform if I were male, if they had a male name attached to them.
I've heard that before.
I'm really curious. It makes me think that maybe I should try publishing under a pseudonym just as an experiment.
And we know J.K.
Rowling
is someone who did that because she was worried. And I have another friend who publishes romance novels, actually, and she also changed her name because her name is ethnic.
Okay.
And apparently white women and very kind of standard names do better.
Oh, I'm not surprised. But yeah, but I've also actually come to think of it, I've also had people say, "Oh, really? Do you make a living off your books? Really? Do your books actually sell, or do you do this? Is writing your only job?" I'm like, yeah. I'm you might want to check my books out on Amazon. You might want to see the 173 reviews.
Exactly.
And there's no clue what.
And you're number 14, I believe, in that
genre today. Yeah, I mean, I usually bounce around between like 9 and 15 for the reading book,
which is great because it's like up to 100 or something.
Yeah, but I mean, people have no idea. And aside from if you're not using those books, but. Yeah, it's just like I said, I've had tiny flashes of experiences of what
that really resonates with me as well, because I think what I'm hearing from you is that you've done what you wanted to do, yes, regardless of your gender. Yes.
And I didn't even think about it in terms of gender initially.
But nonetheless, you have had the experiences that I've had as well, where I'm the only co-founder in a room, and I look around and I'm in a meeting of all men, and I'm like why
seriously?
Is that? Yeah.
Like, you really actually couldn't find another woman who does this? But yeah, I mean, if you look at all the self-published test prep books on Amazon, I'm really the only woman doing it.
I think that's true.
Which is, because the community of people who are successful independent test prep authors is very small, and most of us know each other.
Right.
And I don't know of any other woman who does this. And I only realized this after I'd written the books, and after they'd started to do well. I looked around and I said, I'm kind of alone up here.
Do you feel alone?
Not terribly. I mean, the writing process can be isolating because, you're sitting there in a room just cranking it out.
Right.
And it's nice to have colleagues to talk to. I mean, I did actually co-author a book with somebody, which was a great experience. But, no, I can't say that I do. There are moments, but, I mean, I work this way by choice.
That makes sense. And I think we all find the style of work that works best for us. Something that I'm curious about is if you had to name a woman that you could have an hour-long conversation with, anyone, who would that be?
Oh my goodness. Well, I wrote my college thesis on Madame de Staël, who was basically, she was an extraordinary woman who lived around the time of the French Revolution, and she basically invented comparative literature. And she was an extraordinary literary theorist and social theorist, and just some of the things she writes are astoundingly modern, really, really astonishingly perceptive person, who sort of barreled her way into the world of letters,
which I would imagine was very male-dominated.
It was fairly male-dominated. You did have a fair number of women writing in the pre-revolutionary period, but just an astoundingly brilliant woman, whose contributions I don't think get quite the recognition they deserve. I would love to have a conversation with her.
I must admit, I would have never expected that answer. And that's someone that I have to look up because...
She's the first person who popped into my mind.
That's wonderful. And I don't know who she is, which also makes me realize that so much of our history is invisible.
Yeah. But, she corresponded with Goethe. I mean, she was really quite a formidable personality.
I wanted to thank you for coming on. You are an amazing woman.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. You've taken on an industry that's huge, publishers that are huge. You're doing it despite the challenges that we've discussed day by day. And I think it's really inspiring to hear your story. So thank you for sharing it.
Thank you so much for having me again. I really appreciate it.
And if our listeners want to find your books or any information about you, can you let them know?
Absolutely. So I'm on Amazon. So if you are looking for one-day shipping or free shipping, that is the place to go. And you can just, type in The Critical Reader or Erica Meltzer SAT, as Erica Meltzer ACT, and the books will pop right up. Or I would also encourage people to visit my website, www.thecriticalreader.com. That's just The Critical Reader, no spaces or anything, one word. And you can also find me on Instagram at The Critical Reader.
Fantastic. Thank you. You've been listening to SheVentures. Like what you heard? Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts, and sign up for our newsletter so you never miss a show.